I just felt like I was getting sicker and sicker. And I had pretty much resigned myself to the fact that I was probably dying and I was never going to live to be 30 and I was never going to have children. And I looked down on this day at my pharmacy and I just had this moment where I said, you know what, Madison, it's time for you to take your health into your own hands.
On Connecting the Dots, we aim to redefine what the term healthy means by learning from experts, identifying different areas of our life that impact our well-being, and becoming our greatest health advocates.
We believe that by making small lifestyle changes, people can not only manage, but also prevent a wide range of chronic illnesses we are taught to believe are normal in our society today.
My name's Kathleen Carney. I'm a nutritionist, foodie, author, and creator and co-host of this raw, real, and sometimes ridiculous show.
And I'm Melissa Chamis, the other half of Connecting the Dots. I'm also a certified yoga instructor, Reiki 1 practitioner, and a hustler just trying to survive in corporate America.
We are close friends who bonded over our messy healing journeys and are eager to share our experiences with you.
So come join this journey with us as we all learn to connect the dots between the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual aspects of being human.
We now know that 80% of the reason why people go to the doctor's office is because of stress. It's a stress-induced illness.
So if we want to be working on healing the body, the gut and the brain have to be worked on together.
People get sick and tired of being sick and tired.
Never accept that, oh, I'm just always going to be this way, because there's always something you can do about it.
So make one lifestyle choice after another and do it with support.
The future of health looks like prevention.
It's going to be more common for everybody to have their own customized health plan.
Well, our health is no different than the health of the planet.
It's never too late to feel great.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Connecting the Dots. We are so excited to have our first guest of season 2 on the show. And before Melissa introduces her and we get into some of the main things that we learned from her and why we just adore her as a guest and as a healer and practitioner, I did want to give some background on what we're going to be talking about today and why we specifically chose this guest. So if you joined us for season 1, you know that we had on the incredible Rosie McCann, and she gave us a very, very brief overview of the practice of Ayurveda. And I was so intrigued by this. When she was on the show, I had no idea what Ayurveda even was. And when I got the transcript for the show, it's like the spelling was insane. And I had to really figure out what the heck she was talking about and do some Googling. But once I did find out, I was obsessed. It is a really cool practice that truly takes a holistic view of health, and it is thousands of years old. And so I did want to have an Ayurvedic doctor on the show this season to dive in even deeper, to give us all a true overview of what Ayurveda is and what that looks like in our modern world. And so I'm so excited to announce that we had Madison Madden on the show. And she was just a ray of light, so fun talking to her and learning from her. And actually, to prepare for our interview, Melissa and I read her book and we were just blown away. Her story is incredible. She is just such a cool woman and truly is everything that we could hope for in a guest on the show. She has lived experience. She healed herself from chronic illness and then became an Ayurvedic doctor and a practitioner to help others, which is similar to the journey that Melissa and I are on. Of we go through our own things and we do our own research and we want to help others and share what we're learning. So she's amazing. And I just can't wait for you to hear our conversation with her.
Yeah, so Madison is an Ayurvedic doctor, as Kath said. She's a member of the National Ayurvedic Medical Association and an expert yoga and somatic practitioner. She's also the founder of Live Wise, an Ayurveda and integrative health organization that helps people around the world heal and transform through natural methods. And as Kath was saying, we read her book. And for those who know me, I'm not the greatest when it comes to reading books. And this was one of those books that I actually flew through because it was so relatable, but also such a fascinating concept, because her book is called Mind, Body, Food: Redefining Your Relationship with Food. And one of the things she touches on, well, it's mostly the theme of her book, is looking at food as your longest standing relationship. So I want to read one of the quotes in her book because this really hit home with me, and it might hit home with some of the listeners. Just like a romantic partner is a reflection of you, so is your relationship with food. It reflects your connection to receive sustenance, engage pleasure, and unapologetically offer your authentic self to the world. And I feel like this is something that's not often talked about. And a lot of health practitioners mostly talk about what you should be eating, what you should be doing, but not actually what that relationship is with your food. And sometimes, like I know for me personally, I've struggled with the relationship with food. And I think reading this book really made me think like, oh crap, like I've struggled with allergies my entire life. I've been now developing intolerances, which you've heard in episode 1 of this season, just a lot of different things. And I feel like I now have trust issues with food, where it's like I can't trust the food that I'm eating because I've been taught that some foods harm me. And I know people have trust issues with other relationships in their lives. And it's like, now that I've kind of made that connection because of her book, I can now start to heal or notice when some of those triggers start to come up around food and that whole mindset, which I think was just so fascinating.
Yeah. And we kind of had similar reflections, because when we were having her on the show, it was when you were finding out about your intolerances, and it was when I was trying to heal my gut and my liver and my skin, and doing Katie Stewart's program, who will be a guest this season. I'm really excited about too. And we just were like constantly reflecting on our relationship with food. And one of the quotes in her book that really stuck out to me was, by connecting the dots, cannot make this up, she literally wrote our show title in her book. So by connecting the dots of your story of eating, you can bring clarity to how your relationship with food has influenced your life, and vice versa. So when I was thinking about all of the experiences that I've had that have influenced how I feel about food, or how food has made me feel, or what are my comfort foods and why are they my comfort foods, and really going back throughout my whole life and thinking about these foods specifically and what they mean to me, and why is it so hard for me to cut out foods that do not make me feel good, that cause digestive issues, not forever, but just for a little bit while I heal. Like, why is that so difficult? Or an example of what I was going through that I think you'll hear in this episode was like, when I was doing this cleanse, this program by Katie Stewart, they said, okay, you can only have 20% of the food that you have be inflammatory. And so that included alcohol. So my coach said, oh, that's like 2 drinks. So what did I do? Like, why did I feel like I needed to push the limit? So I would have 2 doubles out, and I'd be like, oh, it's still 2 drinks. I'm still in my limits, but like, why did I feel like I needed to do that? And on a normal day, I don't order doubles, but like, it was just because I had this restriction put on me that I was like, oh, I'm going to do this. And really thinking about that relationship to rules and restrictions and how that impacts how I behave. And one of the biggest reflections I had is, I can't put rules on myself. I can't live in that rigid world. And it's crazy. After I did finish the program, and was like, okay, I'm on my own again. Like, I realized I can't do rules. And what I learned is, when I'm like, I have free reign, I eat healthier because I'm not worried about it. And I choose what my body instinctively wants instead of focusing on these food rules that I've placed on myself. So that was one of the best reflections that I had from reading her book. And it did take going back in time and thinking about what has happened in my life to cause this, and then thinking about my current actions and why the heck am I doing this? It made no sense.
Yeah. And I think that that's something like so great that Madison touches on, not only in her book, but in the episode. And it's like kind of that whole relationship, but also like that freedom aspect and really understanding your body and what works best for you. Because for all my data nerds, there's a lot of data in this book, but it talks a lot about like disordered eating and things that cause dis-ease and how certain things within our body and certain emotions really build up and cause these health issues, these eating issues. And she talks about how the suppression of natural urges is what causes a lot of the diseases, and which is just so fascinating. But she really connects the whole mind body gut connection for us, and I think that was really helpful. But something else she talked about was the doshas, and she'll explain that later in the episode, but it basically is the constitution for how you like what you should be eating and how your body is, whether it's like heat, cooling. I can't really explain it as well as she can, so I'm not even gonna begin to. But in her book there was a quiz that we took that talked about the doshas, and for me, which is very interesting, I'm a tridoshic split, so I'm equally all three parts, which is so every time I'm imbalanced, I'm a different constitution, which is something fascinating I never even knew was possible.
Yeah, no, totally. And I guess the way that it works is like you have, unless you are you, which apparently Madison said is like so special and rare, you usually have one main dosha, and then your second one, if it's like close in percentages, will be like, I forget the exact word she used, but it's like part 2. And then the other one you're just a lot less of, but you do have all 3 in your body. And she'll explain why, like one is more circulation, one's more heat, one's more cooling. So you do have all of them, but what you mainly are will really impact how you should engage in the world. And so we've been doing like a lot more research for you all, because in this episode's resource guide, we actually decided to put together sample meal plans for each of the doshas. So there's Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. And it was really fascinating, truly, to research them all and see what you should be eating, how you should be working out, how you can communicate with others. Like there's so much that goes into it, and it's just very cool if you want to learn more about yourself and what could be really beneficial for your body. And so I'm really grateful because Madison actually is allowing us to put her dosha quiz in our resource guide. So you can take the same quiz that Melissa and I did to find out if you are tridoshic and a unicorn like Melissa, or mostly Vata and then secondary Pitta like me.
Yeah, I mean, if you listen to episode 1, you'll know I feel like I have all the problems in the world. So of course, this is so me. And she was talking about how when you get imbalanced, like you tend to lean towards the one that like you tend to go towards food that you think you need, but it's actually the opposite, which is another fascinating thing. But before we get into the episode, I did want to read one last quote that I thought was really fascinating from her book and leave you with a thought-provoking question. So she talks about the light and the shadow side of a relationship with food. So the light. A well-nourished body is a foundation for good health. It encourages proper growth and healthy aging. It is comforting and nurturing. Its abundance is forthcoming, and with gratitude, we take what we need to sustain us. We encourage healthy systems inside of our body and in the world outside of ourselves. The shadow. When too much sustenance is consumed, either out of fear or out of greed, our bodies and mind become a garden for disease to flourish. When we take more than what we need, our system is overwhelmed and our channels are blocked. We perpetuate unsustainable systems that feed dis-ease in ourselves and others. When sustenance is rejected or unavailable, we become depleted. The body systems become fragile and start to break down. As we neglect ourselves, we are not able to fully show up for others in our lives. So I pose this question to you that Madison poses in the book. As you listen to this episode, I want you to think about, what is your relationship to food as sustenance? How do you experience the light and or the shadow side of it? And it's highly likely you probably experience both.
So true. And as a plug for our girl Madison, if you are intrigued or inspired by any of the quotes we shared or some of our reflections, please buy her book along with our resource guide, because it will change your life like it changed ours.
Yes. Now enjoy the episode.
Well, hi, Madison. Thank you so much for being with us on Connecting the Dots. As Melissa and I said when we got started, we both read your book, Mind, Body, Food, and we were obsessed. So we are very, very excited to have you on the show today.
I am so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So we wanted to start off with our icebreaker, which is, what is something that you're currently reading, watching, or listening to?
I am reading, watching, or listening to none of the above.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah, it's true. I, in the last several months, I've found that, sometimes I go through these phases of feeling like we really are in an information overload in most of our lives. And I spend a lot of the time on the computer doing consultations, emails, video, and all sorts of things. And by the end of the day, I find that it's really nice to give my eyes a break. So I very rarely watch TV, and I very rarely read a book in the last few months. And in audio, I am pretty diverse, whatever I'm feeling. So sorry for the icebreaker, but it's the truth.
No, I love it.
Yeah, no, I love that too, because I feel the same after a long day at working. It's like the last thing I want to look at is a screen or read a book or like think about anything. Just want to
Yeah, absolutely.
Alrighty, let's get into it. So do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your health journey that led you to where you are today?
Sure. Yeah, I would say my journey started when I was about 2 years old. I was, the story goes is that I was playing in a park that had been recently sprayed with pesticides, and I got sick and got treated really heavily with antibiotics and steroids at the time. There wasn't a whole lot of knowledge around what that, or accepted knowledge around the consequences of that on the immune system and on the gut. And I spent my childhood and adolescence sick with all sorts of seemingly unrelated health issues that nobody really knew what to do with. And I was on antibiotics probably 6 to 7 times a year, and had all of these seemingly unrelated things that nobody, went from doctor to doctor and drug to drug. And I missed, upwards of, 50 to 100 days of school a year. And by the time I was 19, I was in college, and I was working with a disability service because I had an injury that, I had a lot of inflammation, a lot of chronic pain in my body. I had chronic digestive issues. I had a long-term eating disorder. I was bulimic. And my sister got me a gift certificate for a craniosacral session. I had never heard of craniosacral therapy before. And I went, and I had somewhat of a profound experience at this appointment, where in the middle of the appointment, I felt this surge of energy into my head, into my brain. And I asked her, what was that? And she said, oh, that was your cerebral spinal fluid entering your brain correctly. It's probably been blocked for a really long time. And I was like, okay, interesting. That was an interesting sensation. And I remember driving home from that appointment, and it was as if the world had just like a little bit more color to it, a little bit more vibrancy. And I got home and I looked down at my pharmacopoeia of pharmaceutical drugs that were on my counter. I was on about 8 or 9 different pharmaceutical drugs. One led to another, which typically had a side effect that led to another. And I just felt like I was getting sicker and sicker. And I had pretty much resigned myself to the fact that I was probably dying and I was never going to live to be 30 and I was never going to have children. And I looked down on this day at my pharmacy and I just had this moment where I said, you know what, Madison, it's time for you to take your health into your own hands. And it's time for you to take responsibility for it. And so that day was a big day. I didn't realize it at the time because it was, just another day, so to speak. I started to wean myself off of medications. I started to change my diet. Changing my diet was the first thing I did. And it was very hard to wean myself off of medications. I went to my doctors to get help, and that was very challenging. So I had to kind of learn how to do it myself. And the first thing I noticed was I changed my diet. That time, what I did is I took out gluten and dairy from my diet. And I noticed a change in the inflammation and pain in my body within days. Within 3 weeks, it had gone down substantially. And I eat gluten now. I can digest gluten just fine, but I had it out of my diet for about 4 years as I healed my gut and, improved my immune system and all of that. And so then that took me on this kind of wild ride because I started to read labels at the grocery store and I started to learn about food and read about food. And then that got me wondering, like, well, why does that happen? And where does that come from? And why are those two things connected? And why aren't those two things connected? And so then I started to learn about agriculture and I got a job at the student farm in college and started to learn about, gardening and agriculture and where food comes from and, all the different reasons why we have the food that we have and don't have the food that we don't have. And that eventually led me to yoga. And I took a yoga class and I grew up historically, I'll admit it, I hated yoga. I was a dancer. I was a professional dancer early on in my life. And I thought yoga was like super boring. And I took a class in college called The Theory and Practice of Yoga. And it was like a college course, almost like a philosophy course in yoga. And I just fell in love with the spiritual practice of yoga. And I still never quite got at the time, I didn't quite get the physical practice or the connection between the two, but I did it. But I really fell in love with yoga as a spiritual practice. And so I went on this search for a teacher, which, in the yogi books, they talk about gurus and teachers and things like that, which growing up in the West is such a foreign concept and also kind of a scary concept and stuff like that. And, but I just had this feeling inside that that's what I needed. And that's what I wanted. And so I ended up in California and I ended up meeting a yogi. And went on basically a 10-year journey of living very closely with my teacher and doing and practicing yoga, not just the physical postures of yoga, but I remember the first time I stepped into the room with this particular human and I did a yoga class and I had this, that's what yoga is. Like, that's the connection. That's why we do asana, okay, I get this now. I get the connection. And so I spent the next 10 years on this journey of both healing myself on a spiritual, physical, mental, emotional level. And that led me to Ayurveda. Ayurveda, for those that don't know, is a sister science to yoga. Ayurveda translates to the science of life. And it is a system of medicine that stems from ancient India. It's actually the longest continually practiced system of medicine that exists today in the world. And I studied Ayurveda and became an Ayurvedic practitioner, Ayurvedic doctor. And the combination of yoga and Ayurveda really was just absolutely incredible for me. It helped me heal the deep-seated patterns and imbalances in my body and put all of these things together that I had kind of like popped up, these questions that I'd popped up in this kind of early part of my healing journey. And I learned so much about nutrition. And eventually I wrote this book, Mind, Body, Food, which is really meant to help people go on an inward journey to transform their relationship with food, not look at their calorie intake or their micronutrients or all those things, but really look at what food is and represents and how it nourishes and doesn't nourish us. And I talk about it from, we have a relationship, a long-term relationship with food that is present from the moment we were conceived to the day we die. And in my description, it is the longest term relationship we have. And I guess I'll stop there. That was kind of long-winded, but I wanted to give a little bit of context for all of that.
I think that was a great amount of context. And I just want to say I had a very similar journey with yoga. So I used to teach yoga. So when my first yoga class, I was like, this is stupid. I don't get it. Like, why? This is not a workout. Like, I don't get the breathing body connect. Like, I don't get it. And then once I started doing it and really getting into it and then found the right teacher, and the right classes, I was like, okay, now I see it. Now I'm really starting to understand that like mind body connection. And
it's an experience that you have to have. Like, you have to have it. You can't really understand it. You have to experience it, right?
Completely agree. Agree.
Yeah, so Melissa and I, admittedly, we read her book after we scheduled your interview, because we were like, she has a book. We've got to learn all about her. And unbeknownst to me, it came at the absolute perfect time. I am studying nutrition right now, about to graduate with my master's this August. Or I guess when this comes out, I will have graduated. So I got my master's in nutrition, but I am learning so much about what I need to heal. So I'm doing a 6-month program to heal my gut because I suffered from chronic acne and was also on antibiotics for so long and got a plethora of other things from that. It's funny when you were talking about like getting treated for so many unrelated issues. Story of my life. And so finally taking a holistic approach to that myself. And when I read your book, it was at the start of a very strict part of this 6-month program where I have to cut out a lot of foods just for the time being, not forever, right now to support my liver and my gut. And I was really struggling. It's wedding season and I'm going on bachelorettes into weddings. And it's been like really, really tough for me to just be like, oh no, I can't eat that. And I was reading your book and reading so many of these reflective questions and being like, but why is it so hard for me to just say like, I can't eat that right now because I'm taking care of me and what my body needs. And like, why do I have this relationship? Or the last quick example I'll say is the last portion of it was 80-20. So 20% could be like whatever you wanted. And so I typically use the 20% for alcohol. And so that's 2 drinks. And so I would, push the limit and get a double for my 2 drinks. Cause it's still only 2. And like thinking like, why can't I just live in these boundaries and be comfortable with it? And so I think that your book just came at such a good time because this entire portion of this program since I felt very comfortable in like what I'm doing and my decisions. And I don't know if I would have gotten here without it.
I'm so glad to hear that. I'm glad that you said that because you guys ask about my journey, right? And I talk about it. And I used to think that it was very unique. Like I kind of felt like I was on an island, with my health issues and with my eating disorder. And unbeknownst to me, so many people are experiencing such a similar journey, both with, like you said, unrelated health issues and undiagnosed gut issues. And I had no idea really until I started to write this book. I knew somewhat beforehand, but when I started to write this book, I really started to realize how ubiquitous eating disorders and disordered eating is. I would say probably 95% of everyone I've ever known has had some sort of disordered eating in their life. And that's men and women combined. And I say it in my book, I say, I actually think we have a culture-wide eating disorder. This isn't an individual thing. And what I experienced is just one dot on the spectrum of this very wide variety of ways that we relate to food in a disordered way. So I'm glad you said that, because this really is an experience that millions of people are going through and feel alone in that journey.
Yeah. And like similar to Kath, like this came at a really good time for me too, because I've suffered from a lot of different allergies and some autoimmune issues that just keep getting worse and worse. And I've been cutting out so many things and cutting out gluten, dairy, legumes, alcohol. I'm like, why is this not getting better? And I'm just almost so okay with just cutting things out at this point, but I'm like, this isn't as enjoyable. So I actually saw an applied kinesiologist the other day, and it seems like there's more hope, but I'm learning like I have to cut out coffee now, which is caffeine is going to be a tough one for me. But like hearing you say that you now eat gluten after cutting it out for 4 years, like that gives me hope that maybe in the future, like I will be able to eat some of these things that I can't now, but once I fully heal my gut. And I think that it's important for listeners to know that there is hope for that. And like once you go on that healing journey.
Yeah. And, that's one of the things that I love about Ayurveda, is that just like everything else, people can be dogmatic about it and, misperceive it and things like that. But it really is meant to help you eat for your constitution and your imbalanced tendencies. And it's not a static thing, like you said, it's not like you should take this herb for the rest of your life, or you can never eat this thing for the rest of your life. It's like, right now, this is what's going on in your body. Let's bring you back to balance. And then in that place, now there's this like dance that you get to do with your balance point, and it's really hard to stay in perfect balance, but how do you relate to that, and how can you use everything that you intake as medicine? And there's a word in Ayurveda called ahara, AHARA. And I know you guys know about it because you read about it. But ahara means, it's a Ayurvedic word for your diet. But when we think of diet, traditionally, we think of just like, the calories we consume. Sometimes you say, how's your diet? And so, I have a diet that's 1,500 calories, right? But in Ayurveda, that word ahara means everything that you intake. It means your food, all forms of food. It means your liquid. So what types of liquid? Water, soda, alcohol, what's in the water, what chemicals are in the water, all that's part of your diet. You have to digest it and assimilate it and eliminate it, right? So your food, your water, your air, and your perceptions. And all of those have to go through a digestive process. In order to go in, and they have to be digested, they have to be assimilated, and they have to be eliminated. And if any of those processes don't work functionally, then there becomes imbalance or dis-ease in the system. And so the diet is such a beautiful thing, because I was in a consultation the other day and I was talking to someone, and we're talking about, his food diet, and it was pretty good and stuff like that. But then we were talking about his life diet and what's on his plate in his life, and how he wasn't able to digest it all. Those perceptions, he wasn't able to digest it all. We have to take, just like sometimes we have to take, a portion off of our plate. Sometimes we have to take a portion off of our plate in our life, or with, like you were talking about, with, how much alcohol you're consuming or what you're breathing, and so all of that, everything that you intake is part of what literally creates your body. And we forget that. It's like, sometimes we think just that it's like about our figure, or how our skin looks or how well we're aging. We forget that literally what we put in our body, like the carrot that I ate at lunch, like literally becomes like my fingernail and my hair and my eyes and my skin. right? It's amazing. We start to kind of break open that barrier of understanding and, kind of like build that relationship. It takes on a whole different robust quality.
Absolutely. And that's something I think, I was relating to you too, when you were talking about how like once your eyes were open to like food and changing your diet, and then how that just continues and continues and continues. Like that was my starting point as well. That was like my buy-in to healing and, on this health journey. But then once you start thinking about, well, what in my life is creating dis-ease, and what in my life is causing me too much stress to function normal or to be able to even digest food, because if we're, constantly in fight or flight, we're not digesting properly. And so I just think that there's such important points that you are hitting home. Also, though, Melissa and I, when we read your book, we took your quiz. And when you mentioned everybody has their own constitution, I was hoping that you could kind of explain to our listeners what that means, and also the 3 doshas.
Sure. So what'd you get, first of all, on your quiz? Do you remember?
Oh, yeah. I was 8 for Vata, and correct me if I'm saying them wrong, please. 7 for Pitta and 3 for
Kapha. Yeah. So 8 for Vata, 7 for Pitta, and 3 for Kapha. So we'd consider, if the quiz is accurate, we would consider you a Vata Pitta constitution. Yeah. How about you?
I was a 6-6-6 split. And
really?
Yeah. And in the past, I've taken quizzes, and I think it was more like Pitta and then Vata. But yeah, I was surprised. I was like, is any of these like off? I'm like, no, every single response was exactly what I was aligned to. So
interesting. Great. Well, so if this quiz is accurate, then that would denote that you had a tridoshic constitution, equal in all doshas, which is actually very rare. But it is one of the constitutions that is outlined. So the doshas get a lot of energy in Ayurveda. It's an entry point to Ayurveda for a lot of people. It is just the beginning of it, though. I just want to preface that. And as you guys read in my book, I was reluctant to even put a dosha quiz in the book because I didn't want people to misunderstand or misuse it, because oftentimes people will take dosha quizzes online and they'll actually answer more from their imbalance than from their constitutional point. And so it can be actually kind of confusing and misguiding. So with that said, I definitely, for all the listeners, I encourage you can take dosha quizzes, but I would also encourage you to bounce that off of a Ayurvedic professional who can read your pulse and look at your tongue and talk to you and all that stuff. So what the doshas are essentially the bioelemental functions that are at play in all of life, not just in the human body, but in all of life. And when you start seeing things through the dosha lens, you start to see them everywhere. You start to see how the seasons have the same dosha clock, and animals and trees and humans and our life cycle, and all these things, the cells and all sorts of things. So kapha, we'll start with kapha, is the foundation, it's the building blocks of life. So it is responsible for creating structure and form. It's the anabolic force, which is building in nature, in quality, right? So kapha's elemental nature is water and earth. Pitta is the metabolic quality. So it's what transforms one thing to another thing, metabolism. Its elemental nature is fire and water. So those often are thought of as opposites. But Pitta dosha is the combination of fire and water. So bile is a good example of that in our system, right? So bile combines fire and water, and it's what digests and transforms food into its next form, which eventually gets transformed into energy. So Pitta let me take a step back. Kapha, the dosha kapha, someone who has a kapha constitution or a kapha prakruti, we call it in Ayurveda, is someone whose natural balance is dominated by kapha. So elementally, it's hard for us to think of things in elemental ways because it seems elementary, but it really is that their bone structure tends to be denser. They tend to hold more water in their body, more liquid in their body naturally. The mentally and emotionally tend towards more kind of sentimentality and compassion and, kind of these watery, grounded, earthy qualities. Whereas pitta tends towards more fiery, more penetrative, more sharp. They tend to find themselves kind of naturally in leadership positions. They tend towards hot emotions like anger and envy and passion and intensity, whereas kaphas tend more towards kind of watery, earthy emotions, Now, vata is the catabolic force. So you've got your anabolic force, the building, the metabolic force, the transformative, and the catabolic force, which is the breaking down or the moving. So vata is responsible for movement in the system. And its elemental nature is air and ether. So it's the lightest in weight and volume of all of the doshas. Actually, not in volume. In volume, it's the most because the ether element has the most volume of any of them. So vata, movement in the body, there's movement of nerve, there's movement of blood, there's movement of air, there's the breaking down and drying out of tissue. So aging is essentially the drying out process of the body. And so as we age, when we hit menopause or, around that time, if you're a male, the body starts to dry quicker, starts to decompose. And vata, that's a vata stage of life in Ayurveda. Vatas, people that have more vata in their constitution tend to have more of an airy quality. And by that can be imbalance. That can be, you're airheaded, right? But it doesn't have to be in imbalance. People that have a lot of vata tend to be very creative. They tend to be very fast moving. They tend to be very quick thinkers. They tend to be people that move around a lot, right? Hard to stay in one place or hard to sit still. And they can tend more towards anxiety. They can tend more towards sleeplessness. They're very sensitive. Vata Prakriti, sometimes they're people that people say are hypersensitive. And I really don't like to use that term because I think that's, it can be an imbalance. But it's a gift of the vata dosha. You can feel very subtle things through touch, through sound, through all of your senses are very subtly attuned. And all of those, what's important to note is that all of those doshas are at play in all of us all the time, in every cell of our body. So every living cell has to have all three of those functions. Every living being has all three of those functions. But the beautiful thing is that we tend to have a dominance of one or two doshas, maybe not in your case, Melissa, of one or two doshas that then predominates our balance in our system, kind of like our recipe of balance. And the closer we stay to our constitutional balance, the healthier we are, or the more resilient we are to external factors that can cause dis-ease. And the farther we get away from our balance point, the more susceptible to imbalance and disease that we are. And so the relevance of this is just so beautiful and so important, because we have this kind of image or this stereotype or this, belief system of what we should look like, typically, especially as women, that colors our understanding of our true nature so much. Whether that's, a idealization of a model form, or wanting bigger boobs, or, a mother that has a different constitution and you grew up feeling fat because your mom was really thin, or, your best friend, or your whatever, all of those different things that come into our mind that color our actual relationship with our true balance, our true nature. And from my perspective, that's one of the most important things that we could possibly do for our health, is get to know what that is, and then work towards accepting that, because that can be very hard, and then learning to love it. So that's a little bit about doshas. I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So how does knowing your dosha help with like eating or the whole healing process?
Yeah, so just like our bodies have doshas, so do foods, and so do spices, and so do herbs, and so do liquids. So they have different qualities to them. Some foods are more heating, some foods are more cooling, some foods are dry, some foods are light, some foods are heavy, some foods are unctuous, or in a combination of those. And so as we get to know our own constitution and the things that keep us in balance and the things that get us out of balance, the more that we can start to use food, not just its nutrient value, but its qualities as medicine. And everything that we intake, like we said earlier, then can become either medicine or a toxin. And really, that's kind of the truth of anything that we bring into our body, into our life. It's either something that's good for us, that's going to nourish us, or it's something that's going to take us out of balance. So the closer you get to know yourself, and then you can start learning about the qualities of food, the more you can build a relationship with what is medicine for you on a daily basis. So for instance, I'm going to give some clear examples that you'll be like, oh, of course, hot chili peppers. What dosha are those?
Pitta.
Pitta, right? They increase heat in the body. They increase acid in the body, right? So someone with a pitta constitution that has issues with acid reflux, and, they wake up at, or they stay up, and their best time of day is between, 10 and 2 a.m. the pitta time of night. They love alcohol, and they love sour foods and things like that. Those are typical cravings for pitta types. But actually, when there's an imbalance of pitta, you want to really, you don't need to eliminate everything necessarily. Sometimes you do, but you really want to be careful with those foods. Whereas things that are cooling in nature and calming, and they help, soothe the lining of the intestine and things like that, like coconut and aloe and cucumber, things like that. The opposite quality of that. Another example of that is, vata types. My favorite saying is crunchy, munchy, dry. Vata types love crunchy, munchy, dry food. So they love, chips and crackers and granola and, popcorn and things like that are crunchy, munchy, dry. And actually, those are the same qualities of where they tend to go out of balance most of the time. And I'm saying all of this is all typical. This isn't necessarily, the truth for everybody. Whereas what's really nourishing for vata types are warm, nourishing, heavy foods. So coffee, for example, what would you think coffee is?
I think coffee is pitta.
It's pitta and vata.
Okay.
Because the pitta is the acid. Sometimes I describe coffee as acid water, right?
Okay.
And it doesn't mean it's bad. It's just, that's the quality of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the caffeine increases vata, right? It stimulates the nervous system. It starts moving fast, right? And so if you have a vata imbalance where your nervous system tends to be overstimulated, you tend to spend more time in your sympathetic nervous system than your parasympathetic nervous system, then coffee is going to increase that imbalance. And so the opposite quality of that would be something that is relaxing to the nervous system, that's calming, that's nourishing. And as we know, there's this bidirectional feedback loop between our gut and our mind that's always at play. And so as soon as we put something in, it is going to affect the way that our mind works, and then essentially the way that our body works.
That makes a lot of sense. And I was really resonating with all of those, I guess, because the tridoshic constitution, is that what you refer to it as?
Mm-hmm.
So in that instance, like how would I guess, would it be that one of the doshas is more out of balance than others at certain time periods, and kind of focus on balancing that one based on how I'm feeling? Like, is that how it works with those?
Yeah. So the tridosha, someone with a tridosha, in a way you have an advantage, because you've got like the beauty of all three doshas that you can kind of call upon. And we would need to look at where you would tend to go out of balance. And so if you would like, I'd be happy to chat about it. Once we know that, then you can kind of target your diet, your lifestyle, your various activities to help bring that dosha back into balance. And now it can get a lot more complex than this, right? So Ayurveda on a clinical level looks at the tissues that are involved, the channels that are involved. Is there toxicity in the body that needs to be eliminated? All of these different things can be addressed, but that's where I would start. It's like, okay, where do you tend to go out of balance? And then we can bring it back.
That makes sense. Yeah, maybe in the future we'll have to talk a little bit more about this. I don't want to bore the listeners with all of my issues right now.
I love it.
Yeah, do you have a question?
Oh gosh, I have so many, but trying to think about, with the time we have, like what would be the most impactful for our listeners, and just thinking about what you do and the services that you offer, and how listeners can start to connect the dots to their own relationship with food. If you think that could be through you, or, if, every single listener can have access to you, like, what do you think a good first step would be as people are trying to navigate this?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is talk about it openly. One of the things that I address in my book is how, as women particularly, we tend to perpetuate each other's disordered eating habits by complementing, disordered behavior, by envying things that are unhealthy for, various things like that. It's so typical, right, for someone to be going through a traumatic time in their life and to lose weight because they're literally not eating, and then to be complimented for it by everybody that they know. And what a strange psychological experience, right? To be like in so much pain, and yet that's the time in your life where you're the most complimented. So, I think we've all probably experienced versions of that in some way or another. So I remember when I felt like I was alone. I had this really kind of what seemed to me like this very gross experience. I was bulimic for many years. I was a dancer. I grew up as a performer and as a woman in our culture, and I would binge as an anxiety, it felt like it was grounding. It felt like it, and then it would go beyond what I thought it was going, and then it felt really gross, and then I wanted to not have the consequence of it, and so I would make myself purge, and then that would kind of build on itself, and it felt gross, and it felt like something I could never admit to anybody. And I remember when I began to open up about it, the first thing that I met was a lot of awkwardness from the women in my life, my best girlfriends. And I didn't quite know how to take that at first, because I was like, oh, maybe I really shouldn't talk about this. And then I realized it was because they were going through something similar and they didn't know how to talk about it, right? And so as I started to be more open about what it was I was going through and my healing process and, my challenges and things like that, I started to realize that that was really refreshing for people, and that I wasn't alone at all. And that having a community and a network that's talking openly about how we relate to food and how we relate to our body image and things like that and to our health is really important. Isolation feeds the sympathetic response, the fight, flight, freeze response. And so when we feel isolated and alone in something, we tend to feed the same things that keep that feeling going. So that's the first thing I would recommend. And just know that you're not alone. And you don't have to be going through something that I'm describing for that to be relevant for you. And then, I'm so glad to hear that you guys read my book and that it was relevant to you, because I wrote this book because I didn't feel like it was part of the conversation about nutrition and health. And I felt like it needs to be part of the conversation, the relationship that we have with food. And so you have that as a resource. And that's a good starting place for, asking, like you were talking about, asking important questions, asking yourself reflective questions that you might not have been asked before, might not have, thought about, having an introduction to Ayurveda and to some of, other traditional forms of medicine and health. And then I would find somebody that you trust to work with. And trust is absolutely vital when it comes to a relationship with a health practitioner. Because when we trust somebody, we let down our guard, and that itself is part of the healing process. So I see people virtually, I see people in person. I'm in Austin, Texas, but there are many people out there that are great resources to talk to. And for some people, that might be a great therapist. And for some people, that might be a great Ayurvedic practitioner. And for some people, that might be a great nutritionist. For some people, that might be a great Ayurveda, acupuncturist or Chinese medical doctor. I have a deep appreciation for many different forms of health. And I really think that they're all valuable if used in the right way. And the more that we get to know, not cherry pick, like, dip our foot and be like, oh no, that doesn't work. The more we get to know the essence of how different forms of medicine work, the more we can utilize them for their strengths.
Yeah, I think the trust with the healer or practitioner is something that is so important. And I always joke that like the best friend I made in New York is my acupuncturist, because like she's just taught me so much and she's helped me learn so much about healing and like my body and like how I react to certain things, and just like that there is hope and that I am not alone. And I think that's just so important for people to know.
Yeah, absolutely.
I kind of wanted to switch a little bit because you had mentioned earlier about the mind-body connection. And I did read in your book a wild fact that I did not know, that 95% of the body's serotonin is in our gut. So can you talk about like if someone's experiencing gut imbalances, are they more likely to suffer from maybe mental health disorders or any other ailments?
Yeah, isn't that an amazing fact? So, in Ayurveda, we've been talking about the mind-gut connection for thousands of years, and now modern medicine, we get to see scientifically how this is true, not just, and there's so many different pathways of this. There's the serotonin that's produced in the gut. There's the vagus nerve that connects the mind and the gut on a nervous system level. There's the gut microbiome, right? So there's all of these different systems that are working in an interdependent way. So absolutely is my answer to that. And I don't mean that in just like mental health disorders, like diagnosed mental health disorders, which that's true too, because we've seen that both in physical and mental conditions, that working on the gut and working on the digestion has a direct effect on the health. Like there's been recent research that's come out on Parkinson's disease, for instance, and how working on the gut and improving the gut has a direct connection on the Parkinson's patients. So yes, absolutely. And so when, there's when you're on an antidepressant, for instance, which you're kind of synthetically creating some of these hormones, and that's one way to help the body produce it. And then another way is to work on your gut. And those are not mutually exclusive. There's a unique path for each person when you're dealing with a mental health condition. But working on your gut health is inevitably going to support. And that is a individual experience. There, you know, sometimes when you say work on your gut health, the first thing people say is like probiotics, right? Or, you know, stop eating gluten, or, you know, whatever, you know, stop eating sugar. There's so many different ways that what we intake affects our gut. And those are all very true. And then there's also the way that our nervous system affects our gut that we often overlook when it comes to gut health. You know, the saying like my stomach turned, right? We hold stress in our gut. And when you're nervous, when you're stressed, when you're anxious, your gut physically is affected by it directly. So working with the mind to affect the gut is also a primary way to increase the serotonin in the system.
We see a lot on Instagram, like those, you know, hack your serotonin things. And so we were curious if that's real, like if there are like serotonin hacks, or is it really getting to the work and being able to heal the gut and heal the thoughts in your mind to have a better mind-gut connection?
I'm not a big fan of hacks in general. I'm skeptical of anything that I see about a hack or a superfood or, you know, things like that. Because you know, I talk about this in my book too. I really don't think there's a magic pill to any of this. And if there were, it would kind of defeat the purpose. I've come to learn that the healing journey is such a beautiful and empowering thing. And there just isn't a magic pill for it. I'm sorry. And so, you know, the hack, yes, it may, what you ideally would want from that, let's say you did a serotonin hack, right? Ideally, what you would get from that is some sort of insight about how you could change your relationship to stress or to food or to whatever it is the hack is talking about. And then that would inform you in your lifestyle going forward. But that itself may work once, but your nervous system is smart. It knows how to get itself back to that state. So until you do that inner work to bring yourself back home to yourself, I really don't think hacks are going to help.
No, I agree with you. And what you just said, like I said, Melissa and I loved your book, and we were texting each other quotes while we were reading it. And one of the ones that stuck with me that you basically just said was that you weren't looking to heal, but for meaning and purpose. And like, I just thought that that was so inspirational. And I think that a lot of people are afraid of healing journeys for, you know, what they have to give up, or those tough conversations that you were saying, like, start there, have those conversations. Like, that's really scary to people. But I think that one of the reasons why we liked your book so much and, you know, we related is because we are both currently on healing journeys and have found so much meaning and so much purpose. And I mean, here we are on Connecting the Dots podcast, living out like how important it is to heal your mind, body, spirit, and all the things, mind, body, food. And so I didn't really have a point to saying all of this, but the point is that don't be afraid, because you are living proof. Melissa and I are becoming living proof that like healing does help you find meaning, purpose, and things that really matter.
Yeah, you know, it's a scary thing to dive into. I remember when I first started practicing yoga with my teacher, I had a dream that I'll never forget. It was a dream in which I was walking down a sidewalk, and I was walking in a line down a sidewalk. And I got to the end of the line, and it was an abyss. It was this big, giant hole. And in the dream, I had to just jump into the abyss. And it was terrifying. And I jumped, and I was free falling into this abyss. And then all of a sudden I grew a squirrel suit. And all of a sudden I could fly. And I had to kind of like, it was really tumultuous at first because I didn't know how to use it. And then all of a sudden I like learned, and I figured it out, and then I could glide, and I was flying in this abyss in this squirrel suit. And it was just like ecstasy. And then eventually I flew back onto the street, and I just kept walking. And, and I'll never forget that experience. It was so real and so tangible at that time. And that's really how I experience a healing journey. It's like, oh, I don't want to jump off the abyss. I don't want to like face that. I don't want to go inside. I have to change things that I don't think I want to. And then you realize that, oh, there's like so much nectar in this, and I get to grow wings. All the ways that I felt held back, or I was pretending, or, all of this stuff that actually is liberating rather than scary. So I agree.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like it is like such a scary leap. It's like people are like, well, what if I fall? Well, what if you fly? Like clearly in your case, you flew. And I think there is hope once you start going down that journey, and it might not be great at the beginning. I feel like sometimes it gets worse before it gets better. But we'll get there. So I think that's a really beautiful dream you had. I did have another question though, that you did mention in your book, that one of the primary causative factors of disease is the suppression of natural urges. Can you talk about what some of those natural urges might be and how they correlate to causing diseases?
Sure. Yeah, in Ayurveda, it states that, according to Ayurveda, that one of the main causes of disease is suppression of natural urges. And those are hunger. So have you ever been hungry and not eaten? And then once you do eat, you have a stomach ache, you get a stomach ache. That's a pretty common thing. And then that actually causes indigestion, it causes heartburn, it doesn't digest, and then it's still, there's all sorts of consequences to that. Drinking, right? Water intake or other forms of nourishment. So the suppression of that type of physical nourishment urge. Bowel movements. The suppression of bowel movements is a very common cause of disease in the system. Starts from a very early age sometimes, or maybe sometimes people have issues like in public or, things like that. Urine, same thing, holding of urine. Sex, sexual urges. So there's a difference between, obsession of sex and a healthy expression of your sexual urges. And when those are suppressed, they cause severe imbalance in the nervous system and in the mind and in the body. I think we can see that culturally over and over and over in lots of different things that happen that I won't name just for, the sake of diplomacy. Yeah, some others are sleep. You suppress sleep, there's major consequences to that. Play, suppression of play, playful urges. Touch, suppression of the urge for touch. So all of the senses need to be fed. And sometimes in spiritual practices and religious practices, we tend to try to ignore the senses as if they're like bad, and that's not the case. We need to create a balanced relationship with our senses. When we suppress the urges, then we end up like playing them out in obsessive ways later, right? Or we create disease in those areas. So all of the senses need to be honored and nourished. Let's see. I mean, those are a few of them, but you can get the point that all of those are suppression. And all of those create disease. And sometimes we think of disease as something that happens to us. And there are things like that, right? There's viruses, there's, lots of things that can happen to us, extrinsic factors. But the more we can keep our body balanced and resilient, the less likely we are to come down with those extrinsic diseases.
Yeah, and I think that's something that is like a really important point that we try to make on this podcast is prevention. And I think that kind of is what you're alluding to, is staying in balance so that if you do, have things happen, your body can handle it. But I'm so sad we're coming to our last few minutes together. I cannot believe how fast an hour has flown by. But we have a couple of closing questions for you. So our first one is, what's one piece of advice you'd give someone starting their health journey today?
Have fun. Enjoy it. Like you were saying with your diet, needing to kind of take things out, and it can feel obligatory, and it can feel like you have to just have discipline and all that stuff. And to an extent that's true sometimes, but learning to enjoy that, like, okay, I have to change my diet. How do I cook something that's like deeply enjoyable to me with the things that I can have? And I think that quality of, okay, have fun and enjoy it is what can get you beyond the limitations that would hold you back to not continue it.
Totally.
I think that's a great piece of advice, and I need to take that more into consideration. So what do you think the future of health looks like?
That's a good question. Well, I think the near future of health is a lot more individual and personal. I think people are starting to realize that they want to have options, and they want to be able to, learn. So there's a lot of like self-health things going on, and a lot of like health tech that is coming out for like, taking your own tests and, having your watch and all of that stuff. But I think the future of health really is in what we're talking about today, in people taking responsibility for their own health, because the system that we have is deeply unsustainable. Our healthcare system is one of the least effective and most expensive of any healthcare system in the world. And that is a supply and demand system. It's not just because of the pharmaceutical companies and the insurance companies, it's also because that's what people want. And so as we start to demand and take responsibility for our own health and wellness, the more options we'll have that cater to that.
I'm ready for that. I'm ready. And our last question is, since this is connecting the dots, could you please tell our listeners how they can connect with you and where they can find you?
Yeah, you can find me at livewiseheal.com. And that's my website. You can also find me on Instagram. I don't know what I think it's Madison Madden _livewiseheal. But you can go to my website and find me there. I'm the worst. That's the best way.
Yeah, and you can send it to us, and we'll link it in the show notes for you too. So
perfect.
No worries.
And you can find my book on Barnes & Noble and on Amazon.
Amazing. Well, we'll be encouraging everyone to read your book.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I hope it serves them.
I'm sure it will. Well, thank you so much for being on our show. This was such a fun interview. already took so many notes and then was just like, I'm just going to be in this conversation and journal after, because it was just so fruitful. And I know that Melissa and I really, really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
I really appreciate being here too. And thanks for having me, and good luck with your program and your own health journeys that you guys are on, and would love to stay in touch.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Connecting the Dots. If there was something that resonated with you, or you simply enjoyed the show, please share it with a friend, leave a 5-star rating and written review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, so you can be the first to know when a new episode is released. And if you'd like to further support us, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow the show on Instagram at connectingthedots.podcast on both platforms. We're also on TikTok at Connecting the Dots Podcast.
We have intentionally curated resource guides that go with every episode to give you the tools, resources, and information you need to make tangible changes at home. You can purchase these guides at katherinecarney.com/resources. If you would like to work with me directly, you can also go to katherinecarney.com/services and book a free discovery call to decide which service is right for you. Make sure you follow me at Kathleen Carney Wellness on Instagram and TikTok.
And I'm Melissa Chamis on Instagram and The Lazy Yogi separated by underscores on TikTok. And we'll link all this information in the show notes to make it easier for you.
We appreciate your continued support and look forward to hanging with you next week.